All right, true story time. I'm Ty McDuffie. Nice to meet everybody. I'm the owner of this platform, Duff Radio. Say hello to Little Creepy. That's Little Mimi C. But today's story time. How I got into a career in journalism. Let's start. This story begins in November of 2021. I was living in North Kansas City at the time in a shitty little $800 a month studio apartment that I could barely afford at the time. I had been working. Oh, what is he? I was bouncing around in between jobs at the time. I was still mainly unemployed, but I had gotten a job with Legal Match working online as a legal writer. And to trace this story back even further, I had always wanted to live out west, always wanted to live in the mountains. I had visited Colorado a couple times as a kid and thought it was just the most beautiful place on the planet. Felt like it called to my soul, and I always knew that at some point I was going to end up living out west in the mountains. So, as I've done with all of my jobs, I found it on Indeed. I had started saving alerts for writing jobs worldwide, nationwide, but also specifically in Montana. So I woke up one morning and I saw that I had an alert for a writing job in Montana as a newspaper editor. And it was for the Big Timber Pioneer in Big Timber, Montana. I had no idea where that was. I had zero experience in journalism, in newspapers, in editing, anything like that. I had zero experience. But it looked like an incredible opportunity. I Googled Big Timber, Montana, which is an absolutely stunning place. The crazy mountains out there are just gorgeous. And it's a super small town, about 1,000 people-ish. And the most important thing that I noticed was that only 8 other people had applied for the job. So I thought that I had a real chance of getting it. So I sent my application. My application at the time, all my work experience was a children's literacy tutor. I had the law school background, which helped. And I had written a couple articles for a hip-hop magazine in Kansas City. And even they fired me because I was hyping up my friends too much and reviewing their albums, giving them all 5-star reviews. And the editor of the magazine said that I wasn't being honest in my reviews, and it lowered their credibility. So I lost that job pretty quickly as well. I basically applied for this newspaper editor job with zero experience to my name. And I really wanted it. So I slept on it that night. I did some research on the company. The company was called Yellowstone Communications. I looked up Yellowstone Communications. I looked up the founder of the company. I looked up the headquarters, which was in Livingston, Montana, and I found that phone number. So what I did the next day was called the Livingston Enterprise, which was the headquarters, the corporate center of this newspaper chain called Yellowstone Communications. They owned 13 or 14 newspapers across mostly rural Montana at the time. And I didn't get an answer. So I left a message, introduced myself, said I'm Ty McDuffie. I'm applying for this job in Big Timber. I explained a little bit of my background and why I was interested. And then just said I hope to hear back from you. So another day went by, didn't hear back, and I found John Sullivan, who was the president of the company and the owner of Yellowstone Communications, and I reached out to him as well, sent him an email, and it wasn't long after that I heard back from them. They gave me a brief introductory interview, asking about who I was, why I wanted the job, why I wanted to move to Montana, specifically from Kansas City, Missouri, as it's about a 18-hour drive. And I explained that I wanted to move out west. I had nothing going for me in Kansas City, absolutely nothing. And I was ready for a new start. So they seemed interested in me, and they appreciated the fact that I took the initiative and reached out to them, sent letters, sent emails, called as many people in the company as I could find. So time goes on. I still haven't told anybody about this idea, and I was just praying on it. In between the first introductory phone call and when I had a real interview scheduled, I went back to Lake of the Ozarks, Missouri, where I'm from, where my family lives, grandparents live, and I still hadn't told anybody about my plan or that I had applied for this job. And I remember just walking around my grandparents' farm, hiking, totally alone, and I was just praying to God that if this was the right opportunity for me, please let it happen. Please take me to Montana. And so I go back to Kansas City and I do my formal interview. I initially got a call from John Sullivan, who, like I said, was the owner of Yellowstone Communications, and he was a legend in Montana media and newspapers in general. He had started that newspaper chain and had controlled it for decades until he eventually sold it later on. But I remember speaking with him on the phone, and I just walked around my apartment and this little park that was behind it in the neighborhoods. And it was about that time in fall, whenever it starts getting cold and brisk outside. The leaves had started changing and falling off the trees. And I remember talking to John for 2 hours or so as I just walked and walked and walked and talked to him about the opportunity, what it would entail. And it was at that time that he told me that they actually had more use for me in this town called Hardin, Montana. So I learned that the original job that I had applied for in Big Timber was no longer the plan, and that if we were to go forward with this opportunity, that I would be in Hardin, Montana. So John then explained to me what Hardin, Montana was. He explained that it was a little town of about 3,000 people in southeastern Montana, very rural, that it bordered the Crow Native American Reservation, and explained to me what all went into that. Said that it would take a very particular person for the job, and I was up for it. I have always been a person who's up for adventure. I like to go down the path less traveled, and I was a completely clueless kid at this time. So I go into my formal interview. It's a short Zoom call, and I meet with John Sullivan, the publisher. I meet with Scott Squillis, who is another member of the organization. He was more on the financial side of things. And I didn't even dress up for the interview. This is how very, very early days of my career I'm talking. I was wearing just a green jacket, a black t-shirt, and I like to do something before each of my interviews, and it's helped me be very successful in many interviews since. But I started this practice during this particular interview for my job as a newspaper editor in Montana. As I'm sitting there on my computer, nerves, I'm waiting to be let into the Zoom meeting, but I just got out a piece of paper in a notebook and pen, and I just started writing positive affirmations to myself. I'm skilled. I'm confident. I'm exactly what these people are looking for. I can do anything. Really just hyping myself up, affirming myself positively, and taking 5 minutes or so to just write down positive things about myself and boosting my confidence and reinforcing these things in my brain before the interview started and before I started talking to people. That really helped me. because it made me less nervous. I was able to appear more present, more calm, more centered during the interview. So I did the interview. I don't remember many details of what we talked about right off the top of my head, other than just I had very little experience. This would be a risk and an adventure on both sides. So I'm very appreciative for Yellowstone Communications eventually taking a shot on me. And I ended up getting the job. They offered it to me, and I could not believe it. I was so thrilled and happy and pumped. But I hadn't accepted the job yet. There were a few things that I wanted to do first. I had a lot of goodbyes to say, and I had a big old bag of mushrooms that I wanted to use and sit and really think about this decision. So I planned a night where I had nothing to do and got everything ready. I like to use psilocybin in this one particular way. Some people on the internet will say that if you mix mushrooms with an acidic juice like orange juice or fruit juice or something like that, it breaks down the cell barriers. I'm probably totally butchering this, but it helps the gut digest the psilocybin faster. So I made this smoothie. I mixed up mushrooms and some Dollar Tree fruit bags that I had gotten, because at that time I was so broke that literally the only way that I could even eat was walking from my little shitty apartment in North Kansas City across the street to the Dollar Tree. And that was how I survived. I would just get little bags of fruit, little bags of fish, little bags of rice, and just sustain myself somehow as I was trying to find ways to make money, trying to find a job, trying to find a career after I got out of law school. So that night comes upon me. I sleep on it, wake up really early the next morning, and decide to take these mushrooms. So I gulp down my drink as I'm in the dark taking a hot shower. And what I was doing at the time, because this was just a tiny little 1-bedroom apartment, but the closet of it was beautiful. It was big, had a lot of space, no windows, and I would just shut myself in there early in the mornings and just meditate with this calming noise in my ears. So this particular morning, I had just drank a lot of mushrooms, and I decided to do the same thing, go sit in my closet and meditate and really find out if this is what I'm about to do. So I'm sitting in my closet. I'm starting to see these beautiful closed-eyed visions behind my eyes. And I got very, very emotional because Kansas City was my home at the time. I had a lot of friends there. I'd spent the last 3-4-ish years in the Lee Summit in Kansas City area. And moving to Montana was a very scary thought to me because I knew nobody. And it would be a giant step going out on my own, really for the first time, away from my home state of Missouri. So I started crying in my closet, really just meditating hard about these goodbyes that were coming and feeling all of those emotions, what it would mean to leave and to move on and do something new with my life and my time. And I sat with those feelings for a while and allowed myself to process them in a healthy way, in my opinion. And eventually this white light, this radiant light, just came over me. And I felt such peace. I felt such calmness in that moment. And what I understood was that no matter what happened, I was going to be okay. And it was at that moment that I decided to move forward with the utmost confidence that I was going to go to Montana and do this thing. And it all came from a mushroom trip and just seeing this white light behind my eyes. And I don't know if that was God or if that's my subconscious mind. Whatever it is, that's beyond my capacity to understand. But that gave me the confidence to move forward at that very moment. And so I did it. I eventually called my parents and tell them, hey, Applied for this job several weeks ago. I've gone through 2 or 3 rounds of interviews and I got it. So I'm moving. And broke that news to them, broke that news to my friends and everybody else that I knew. And this was about December at this time. A couple of weeks had passed. And so they wanted me to come up there as soon as possible and asked how quickly I could make the journey. And I said I could be up there the next weekend, and so I was. I didn't know how to get out of my apartment lease. All I had was my little Chevy Malibu at the time, and I was going to drive that Chevy Malibu from Kansas City all the way up to Montana in December at the start of winter. So the weekend when it's time to move comes, and I'm still all alone in my little apartment. It's like 8 o'clock at night, and I was planning on leaving the next day, the next morning. And I'm just going through my apartment, packing up as much shit as I can. I couldn't bring my bed. I couldn't bring any of my furniture. I couldn't bring my desks, nothing like that, because obviously in a Chevy Malibu, there's not enough room for any of that stuff. So the plan was I was going to have to fly back at some point and get a U-Haul, a big truck, load up my bed, load up my furniture, things like that, and then drive back to Montana again. But I loaded up just houseplants, basic clothes, the warmest clothes that I had, which were not a lot at that point. And I was so anxious and antsy that I just decided to leave. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't wait until the next morning. I just drove, got on the road, typed in Livingston, Montana, wherever the hell that was, and just got in my Chevy Malibu and left. So I'm driving through the night. There are several states that I pass going from Missouri into Montana. It's one of the most beautiful drives in the country, and I highly recommend it to anybody. But going north from Kansas City, the first state that you run into is Iowa. And of course, it's night at this point, so I can't see too much. But those states, it's just plains as you drive through it, especially northern Missouri and into Iowa. It's beautiful country, but it's flat, it's cold, barren. And it was in Iowa that I ran into snow for the first time, just the very beginning of a winter storm. And I'm driving underneath the night sky, and it's incredibly beautiful. I see the Big Dipper out. I talk to my sister on the phone as I'm driving up during these 18 hours and just taking in my new life, my new decisions. I get from Iowa to Nebraska. Nebraska's a long part of the drive, but it's also incredibly beautiful. Then eventually I got into South Dakota. By South Dakota, I was exhausted, and the sun was starting to come up over the Black Hills region of South Dakota, an incredibly beautiful place. South Dakota is magnificent. I would go back there anytime, any day. But as I'm driving through, the sun's starting to come up, and it's so empty in South Dakota and some of these northern states where if I had to pee, I would just get out of my car on the side of the highway and just pee, because there's not a single soul coming this way or this way on the highway. It's absolutely empty. And that's one thing that I would like to touch on for those people out there who think we're so overpopulated or there's no more room in America. Trust me, there is. It's all just up north where it's extremely cold and rural. But those states like South Dakota, North Dakota, Wyoming, Montana, there's plenty of space up there, tons of land, and very, very few people. So I'm driving through, I believe I'm in about Keystone-ish area, South Dakota, and I see that Mount Rushmore was not far away. It was about a 30-minute detour to the west from the way that I was initially going. And I decided, shit, why not? I'm probably not ever going to come back this way again. I'm definitely not going to drive however much further I still had, like 8 hours back just to go to Mount Rushmore. So I turn left, I get on the road, and I'm driving through to Mount Rushmore. I'll briefly describe what that drive up to Mount Rushmore is like. It's absolutely breathtaking. Driving through just the Black Hills, up through this winding road, all these cliffs, beautiful animals. I believe I saw 2 or 3 bald eagles at the time. But it's absolutely stunning. If you ever get a chance to go to Mount Rushmore, please do, because it's a beautiful sight and a great American monument. I mean, it's amazing how they built that thing there. But the sun has risen at this point. It's the middle of December, so there's really nobody at Mount Rushmore at the national park at this time. So I had an incredibly unique experience where I had that entire place to myself. It was very early in the morning and it wasn't tourist season, so I got an unobstructed view of Mount Rushmore, and there was not a soul out there next to me. And that is a memory that I'll take with me for the rest of my life. It was cold, snowy, but it was beautiful just to sit there with my own thoughts and look at Mount Rushmore, take pictures, take videos, and be able to enjoy that moment with just myself. So I stare at the monument for long enough, and I decide to go back to my car. I drove into the parking garage at Mount Rushmore, leaned my seat back in my Chevy Malibu, and just caught a little bit of sleep. I'm talking like 20 minutes, maybe. I don't know if I even fell asleep because it's hard for me to sleep in cars, but after that, I got on the road. And the back roads from Mount Rushmore into Wyoming are even more spectacular. I wish I could remember some of the names of these little towns that I drove through, or what the national forest is coming down from Mount Rushmore into Wyoming, but it's absolutely spectacular. And so I'm in uncharted territory, driving through these little itty bitty towns in Wyoming at this point, and the distances between towns are starting to get larger and larger and larger. And it was at this point when I got to Wyoming that I started running into some serious blizzards. And I did not have snow tires, no 4-wheel drive, nothing like that. I didn't even have a truck. I'm in my Chevy Malibu. So looking back on this situation, I was very unprepared for the circumstances that were going on outside weather-wise, and just for the trip in general. I mean, I was totally clueless as to what I was getting myself into. That'll all come in a later video as I just explain some of these things that happened in my time as a newspaper editor in Montana. It was absolutely insane and one of the most memorable times of my life. So I'm driving through the snow and I'm listening to Drake. If you're reading this, it's too late. One of my favorite albums of all time, bar none. And eventually I get to the Montana border, and after the Montana border, I get into Crow Nation, which once you get into Crow Nation, it's just a sign basically in the middle of nowhere in the mountains. And coming through Wyoming into the Bighorn Mountains and into Montana, into Crow territory, that's another spectacular area of the country. It's one of the windiest places I've ever been. And that was one of the times when I was most scared on this drive, because the winds were absolutely rattling my car left to right. There's no snow plows out here either, by the way. On these interstates where there's literally nobody driving, I know if you live in a big city or somewhere that's more populated, it's hard to believe, but there are places out there where if it snows, there are no snowplows out there. They're not touching it because it's so far out and in between places, especially in Wyoming. I always say that Wyoming is one of the scariest places that I've ever been, probably one of the scariest places in the country because it is so desolate, so isolated. And if I would have gotten into a wreck out there, I would have been absolutely screwed, because you can drive easily 2 hours and not see another city, not see another town, not see another person. That's how big and empty these places are. But that's also what makes them so spectacular and beautiful and wild. It's just their pure emptiness. They're one of the last unspoiled places on this planet. I truly believe that, especially in America. I mean, it's unlike anything else. But I get into crow territory, and in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, this is where I'm about to live. This is where I'm about to work. So I'm taking it all in, and it just feels so new and so exciting. And the Crow Reservation is absolutely gorgeous. It's the largest reservation in Montana. It's over 2 million acres. I believe 2.2 million acres of land, mostly untouched. And I couldn't believe my eyes as to what I was seeing. Driving through, I come across lodge grass. I come across these different towns that are popping up on the reservation. All of them super small. All of them looking somewhat underdeveloped. Didn't look like there was a whole lot of economy going on there, but I was just taking it in. And I drive through the Crow Reservation, and I drove through Crow Agency, which is the largest spot in the Crow Reservation. I wouldn't call it like the capital, but that's kind of something that you can think about if you're unfamiliar with it. It's the main hub of the reservation, the largest part, where most people live. And interestingly enough, I saw that gas on the reservation was more expensive than anywhere else in the country that I had been on that trip. Driving up through Wyoming, driving up through Iowa, driving up through Nebraska, South Dakota, gas prices on the road, on the interstate, were not higher anywhere else than they were on the Crow Reservation. And I found that very, very interesting. I don't know the reason for that. I don't know if it's because it is so isolated, it's hard to get gas there, although I find that hard to believe. But just something to think about there. So I'll keep moving on with the story. I drive through the Crow Reservation, and eventually, about an hour-ish, 30 minutes-ish, to the west of the Crow Reservation is Hardin, this other little town, about 3,000 people. So I drive through that, and I'm kind of taking it all in. Although I wasn't actually in the town at the time, I just passed it on the interstate. But I see my future home, and I take it all in. And I continue driving about 2 more hours west until I get to Livingston, Montana, which, per the terms of this agreement that I had signed to come on as a newspaper editor with Yellowstone Communications, I was going to train in Livingston, Montana, and work at the Livingston Enterprise, the newspaper there in the town, for about a month to get my feet under me, learn the ropes of journalism, of news reporting, learn more about the town, the people, and the people that I would be working with, and go from there. So I pull up to the Livingston Enterprise, and I was very happy at the time because it looked like one of the nicest buildings in town. And Livingston itself is absolutely gorgeous. It's this tiny little pioneer town almost, but it's flanked by these massive mountains. And it's one of the gateways to Yellowstone National Park. If you want to get to Yellowstone, you're going to be passing through Livingston. So I'm sure that's part of its culture and part of its economy is tourism, people passing through it on their way to the national park, Yellowstone. But at this time, it's still middle of December. It wasn't even Christmas yet. But it's cold and there's a lot of snow on the ground already. So I pull up to the Livingston Enterprise. First time I'm meeting my new employers. First time I'm meeting anybody. And I haven't showered in a night and a day. On top of that, I'm dressed kind of like I am right now. Just like sweats and a sweatshirt. Not looking the most professional by any means, but I walk in through the front door of the Livingston Enterprise, and I'm greeted by some lady, and I explained who I was and why I was there, what I was doing. And she takes me back and introduces me to John Sullivan and Scott Squillis and some of the other important people within the organization. And they just briefly sat me down. They were very kind and gave me about $500-ish to get me from Kansas City up to Livingston. I'm racking my mind to think if that number's correct, but it sounds pretty right with gas prices and the amount of times that I had to fill up going from here to there. That's kind of beside the point. But we introduce each other, shake hands, and John Sullivan owned some rental property in Livingston, and one of them was this tiny little apartment that he rented out sometimes to people who worked at the Enterprise. So that night, after we're done with our introductions, he takes me over to this apartment, gives me the key, and lets me in. They were very kind, and they let me stay there for free. I think he originally charged tenants like $600 a month. I mean, that's how small this place was. And this is also a couple years ago too, so rent prices were a little different. But again, they were very kind in letting me stay there for free for a month as I got to learn the hang of things. And this little apartment, I mean, there's no TV in there. It was literally just like a room with a twin bed, a refrigerator, a bathroom. That's it. But it was perfect for what I needed at the time. I mean, the only belongings I had were basically the clothes that I could fit in the trunk of my Malibu. I mean, when I say I moved up there with nothing, like I literally had nothing to my name. And there was a train that drove by this apartment and drove through Livingston. And I just remember hearing it all the time as I would sleep. And it just became part of my life as I lived there. So I start working at the Livingston Enterprise for a month. I go around town. I'm meeting different people. This is when marijuana was first legalized in Montana. So I did a story on that. I met one of the dispensary owners who is now receiving just a giant influx of business. I remember it snowed super hard one day, so I went around and just took pictures of people in the snow and wrote a story about that. And in the meantime, I was learning about journalism and newspapers and how it all worked. And I basically got a journalism school education in like 2 weeks from this guy, John Sullivan, who, to his credit, was great. He taught me so much, and he was extremely hard on me during my time as an editor and as an employee of his. But looking back on it, I think he was just trying to teach me the skill of communicating with people. And he pushed me really hard, my written communication, all these different skills that I had to learn in order to actually be successful. Mimi, what do you have? Come here. What do you have? What do you have? He doesn't have anything. But yeah, like I said, I got a journalism school education in 2 weeks. I learned pretty much all there is to know, and I had a professional writing background from undergrad, so I wasn't at a complete disadvantage here. And I'd been a writer for my entire life. I'm talking second grade. I'd been keeping journals onwards. So I felt pretty confident about my skills there. And I remember one day in particular where one of the stories fell through. And this is probably my third day on the job or so, but I got the lead story in the newspaper. I was on the front page. My photography and my writing was, and I felt so proud about that. And the employees were saying, oh, well, thank goodness we have Ty, because if we didn't, we would have been screwed today. And that was just one of the small victories that propelled me forward and gave me more confidence throughout this time when I was in Livingston and I was on my own and I was just exploring completely by myself. And it was actually super fun. So there's a little Chinese restaurant in Livingston that I went to. There's actually not that much else to do. I didn't partake in any of the nightlife. I didn't go out and hang out with new friends or anything. I was really quite exhausted throughout this entire process because I was working an 8 to 5 at the newspaper, and they did not pay me very much. I really want to say they paid $13 an hour. So it's safe to say this experience was not about the money for me. It was more about adventure, travel, getting to Montana, which was the destination that I wanted to be, and connecting with the right people. So I was doing an 8 to 5 at the newspaper. And then I would come home and I would do my legal match articles. And that kept me super busy. Like, I really had no time to do anything else. I could barely even fit a workout in. And there's this one little gym downtown in Livingston, and I just got a couple of workouts in there. It was a small gym, but I'm thankful for it because it served the purpose that I needed. I spent a decent amount of time at the library, checking out books, reading, working there as well. And I really enjoyed my time in Livingston. So I went home for Christmas after spending a couple weeks in Livingston and reconnected with my family, talked to everybody about my experiences, what I had been doing. And then I flew back into Bozeman. And I got into Bozeman at probably, hey, Mimi, no. I got into Bozeman at probably 2 a.m., and I had to be at work at 8 the next morning. So I drive about the 30-ish minutes from Bozeman to Livingston whenever I had gotten back after Christmas. And it was so treacherous outside. Ice, snow, very, very cold. Again, I'm in my Chevy Malibu, so I'm pretty unprepared. That was kind of the theme of this whole thing is I jumped into it. I took a risk without knowing what I was doing or what I was getting into, and I'm so glad that I did. But they had originally scheduled me to work at the Livingston Enterprise for a month, and I didn't quite make it that long before they called me up, in their words, and graduated me from this kind of miniature training program that they had put together for me. I had spent a lot of time with a guy named Dwight Harriman, who I believe still works at the Livingston Enterprise, and he later became the editor, which he rightfully deserves because he was such a hard worker and such a smart guy. But he was a columnist, and he was the one who showed me how to do page design on Adobe. So I spent a lot of time just at his computer with him, watching how he designed these pages and how he put pictures in different places and text boxes in different places and generally designed the newspaper and got the newspaper from just words into a page, and then the page would go into the printing press, and then it would eventually go from there to be printed and distributed across the town. And it was a very interesting process to watch because Livingston, as I mentioned, was the headquarters for the whole Yellowstone communications operation, 14 newspapers. So all of those newspapers across the state of Montana were being printed in this one location. And they had a whole team of people in this back room in kind of this factory-like environment where they're printing just thousands of pages every single day. Well, not every single day. The Livingston Enterprise was one of the only daily newspapers in the chain. The others were weekly. So we were really working hard every day to get new stories, to get new interviews. And I'm thankful for that because it sharpened my pen immediately. I was working and doing stories every single day, and at that time I learned how to be productive, how to get a task from start to finish in a very short amount of time, especially with writing. And it's not one of those things where you have a whole lot of oversight. Yes, there are editors. Yes, it's important for 2 or so people to check your work as a journalist and as a writer, but we weren't really relying on a whole lot of editorial oversight to go from story started, story finished, send it off. So I've always kind of been that way, like getting a project and just starting it and finishing it and not taking too much time to do so, because in our case there wasn't a lot of time, because we had to get the newspaper out by 2 p.m. every day, and if a story wasn't done and turned in by 2 p.m. it wasn't going to be in the newspaper. And I was really thrilled to get my work out there in the newspaper, because not only did I want to impress these people who had been to journalism school and had worked all these different jobs and had experience in the industry and were highly accomplished, and I wanted to prove that I fit in and that my skill as a writer was up to par, but this was also getting my name on the internet. I thought it was so cool that for the first time I could type in Ty McDuffey on the internet and my writing would appear on Google. And that had been something that I was working towards for a really long time. I wanted a career as a writer, and this was my chance to do it. And I just could not believe that my life had taken this turn, that I ended up in this place in Montana, which was so gorgeous, with all these different people that I was meeting, and I got to explore Bozeman, and I eventually got to go out to Yellowstone on my own during the middle of winter and see all these different animals and drive through the park in the mountains and see the Yellowstone River. And it was just so invigorating and so new and so fresh, and it was such a great adventure for me as a younger man. At this point, we're going back almost 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago at this point. It's been a while. So that essentially is how I got my start into journalism. They graduated me from this kind of makeshift training program, and I packed up my little apartment in Livingston with the very few things that I owned, and I drove the 3 hours from Livingston to Hardin, Montana, where I was going to set up shop for the next year as the editor of the Bighorn County News. Hardin sits in Bighorn County, Montana, and the newspaper was dispersed throughout this entire county, which I mentioned before includes the 2.2 million acre Crow reservation. So my readership was the town of Hardin, about 3,000 people, but also everybody who lived on the Crow reservation, and that was several little towns and villages across the reservation, which over the course of that next year I got to see and drive around on these newspaper routes and really see how people live and what the reservation was like. And I got to talk to a ton of different people, and it turned out to be one of the most beautiful experiences of my entire life. But the other thing that this opportunity really taught me was how to stand up for myself, how to connect with people, and how to get what I want. Because when I first got up there, I had no housing. I had nowhere to stay, nowhere to live, and I didn't know anybody. So when it was time for me to move to Hardin, I had to call a bunch of realtors, a bunch of landlords, and just try to find a place to live. And if you've lived in a small town before, you know that you kind of got to just take what you can get. And so I'm making these phone calls, and I got super lucky to get in touch with this guy who owned a cabin out on the Bighorn River a little bit east of Hardin. And he was a Colorado resident. I believe he lived in Denver, but he had the cabin empty at the time. And so he was going to charge me $1,800 a month to live there. And At that time, that was so much more than I had ever paid in rent anywhere in my life. Like, to the point where I wasn't quite sure how I was going to make it happen, but I knew that I had to make it happen. And he was very gracious and allowed me to rent his cabin. One of the most gorgeous places I've ever seen. Literally walk out from the back door of this cabin and it's right on the banks of the Bighorn River. The Bighorn River being one of the best trout streams in the entire world. Like top 2, top 3. People fly in from all over the world to fish this river. And I was lucky enough to just have a spot where I could live right on it. And I secured that housing for myself, and I drove the 3 hours from Livingston back east to Hardin, Montana. Now, Hardin, Montana is not what you would picture when you think of Montana. That's more Livingston. That's more Bozeman. That's more Yellowstone. These giant mountains. Just beautiful scenery everywhere. Hardin is more plains-like. As is much of eastern and southern Montana. It's more like being in the plains. So it's flatter. There are some mountains, but not like that. So it was less glamorous for sure. And I came to just love Hardin. I mean, I feel like I fit in there so perfectly, being a small town person myself. But I also took a lot of initiative to meet people and be friendly. And it was at this time that I learned so many people skills. Just being in newspapers, being in editing, being in communications, being in writing. And I was lucky enough at the Hardin library to come across this book about body language. And it taught me so much about nonverbal communication with people. And that helped me, being a stranger in a new place. It helped me to be confident. It helped me to portray outwardly that I was friendly. I had positive body language. I wasn't walking around like this, looking scared or with my arms crossed or biting my nails or anything like that. I really took a giant leap in my confidence there because I was able to go out on my own and I was able to make it happen for myself in a small town. And so it wasn't long after that I started at the Bighorn County News in this little building on Center Street in Hardin, 206 North Center Street, or maybe 204 North Center Street is what it was. But I got to know some of the employees at the time. There was only me and one other employee. Her name was Maureen. She was a front desk worker, secretary type employee, and I was the editor. And not only was I the editor of the newspaper, but I was the sole reporter. So I was responsible for getting this entire thing done, all of the content on my own. And this was in the midst of county election season. This was in the midst of a lot of political turmoil in the county at the time, which I should definitely get into in a different video. But this basically explains how I got into journalism from the start. It did not require a degree on my part. It did not require me to have any type of relevant experience or any experience at all. But I was able to get this job basically due to persistence on my part, from recognizing the dream that I had, which was to get out west and live in the mountains in Montana, seeing the right opportunity at the right time, recognizing that not many other people had applied for this job. And then I jumped the gun on it. I had my application ready. I researched John Sullivan, the founder and owner of Yellowstone Communications, and I called and I called and I called and I sent emails. And I think people really appreciate that. They appreciate persistence. They appreciate taking the initiative. And I convinced them to take a risk on me, and it paid off. And I think I did good work there. And I'm very proud of what I accomplished and the people that I met during my time in journalism. So I think the point that I'll leave with is that for anybody out there who wants to start a career as a writer, a career in journalism, it doesn't have to be anything difficult. And I would go so far to say that you do not need a journalism degree to be a successful journalist. Now, if you want to go work for the New York Times or whatever else, probably not going to be able to just make a phone call and walk in the door like I did. But for these smaller local papers in rural areas, which is a pretty specific use case, I realize that. But that's what I did. Just being friendly, having people skills, and then getting lucky and having a company take a risk on me. That is how I got into journalism. Thank you for listening. I hope you check out the other things that we have on Duff Radio. If you like this video, leave a comment. I always respond to them. I'm happy to talk with people. And hopefully you learned something. Hopefully this was entertaining. I really enjoy doing these types of talks, and I'm definitely going to continue doing them more. Just telling my stories, my life experience, things that I think people might enjoy. So that's all I've got for today. Thank you.